This is a historically inspired fictional narrative based on real patterns of frontier crime in 1840s America. While the characters and specific events are fictional, the historical context, social conditions, and types of crimes depicted are based on documented cases from the era. In the autumn of 1849, when workmen clearing land for a new road approximately 8 miles west of the small Kentucky settlement of Millbrook made a horrifying discovery, they uncovered one of the most shocking crime sprees in American frontier history. What began as routine work, removing brush and leveling ground for a wagon road, turned into a nightmare when shovels struck something that was clearly not rock or root. Within hours of that first discovery, the workers had unearthed 43 graves, buried in neat rows on a hillside that overlooked what had once been Millbrook Inn, an establishment that had operated for barely 2 years before mysteriously closing in early 1848. The inn had been run by two women who called themselves the Cunningham Sisters, Abigail and Constance, though, as the investigation would reveal, almost everything about these women, from their names to their supposed sisterhood to their backgrounds, was a carefully constructed lie. Over the course of approximately 18 months, from the summer of 1846 through the winter of 1847-48, these women had systematically murdered at least 43 people, possibly many more, making them among the most prolific serial killers in American history, and certainly the most deadly female killers ever documented in the United States. This is the story of the Cunningham Sisters and the Millbrook Inn, a tale that begins with two mysterious women arriving in a remote Kentucky settlement with money to invest and plans to open an inn, and ends with dozens of graves, a community torn apart by suspicion and grief, and questions that remain unanswered even today about who these women really were, and how they managed to kill so many people without arousing suspicion until it was far too late. To understand how such a horror could unfold, we must first understand the context of frontier Kentucky in the 1840s, a place and time where isolation, transience, and the absence of effective law enforcement created opportunities for criminals who were willing to be ruthless and patient. Kentucky in 1846 was no longer the wild frontier it had been 50 years earlier, but in rural areas, particularly in the mountainous regions and along remote roads connecting small settlements, it retained much of its frontier character. Communities were small and scattered, law enforcement was minimal, and travelers passing through were common and largely anonymous. Millbrook was one of these small settlements, hardly deserving of the name town, with its population of perhaps 200 souls spread across farms and homesteads in a 10-mile radius around a crossroads where a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and a few other buildings clustered together. The area was on a secondary route between larger towns, and travelers did pass through with some regularity, merchants transporting goods, families moving westward, laborers going from one job to another, itinerant preachers and salesmen, and the various other people who moved through the American frontier in the middle of the 19th century. The lack of accommodation for these travelers had been a subject of occasional discussion among Millbrook's residents. The nearest proper inn was over 20 miles away, and travelers often had to impose on the hospitality of local families or camp rough when passing through the area. So when two well-dressed, well-spoken women arrived in Millbrook in the early summer of 1846 and inquired about purchasing land to establish an inn, they were welcomed by the community as potential benefactors who would fill a genuine need while also bringing business and a certain amount of prestige to the settlement. The women who introduced themselves as Abigail and Constance Cunningham appeared to be in their 30s, though it was difficult to judge precisely. They dressed in the sober, respectable fashion of middle-class women of the era. They spoke with what sounded like educated Eastern accents, and they comported themselves with the dignity and propriety expected of respectable ladies. They told a story that was sad but not unusual for the time. They were sisters, they said, recently widowed, both of them, by different circumstances within a year of each other, left with modest inheritances but no close family, and seeking to make a new start in a place where they would not be constantly reminded of their losses. The story was plausible, even sympathetic, and it explained why two apparently respectable women would be traveling without male protection and seeking to establish a business in a remote location. Widows did sometimes pool resources and establish businesses together, and the frontier offered opportunities not available in more settled areas where social restrictions on women were stricter. The Millbrook community accepted the Cunningham Sisters' story at face value, welcomed them, and facilitated their purchase of a plot of land about 2 miles from the main settlement, situated along the road where travelers regularly passed. The land they purchased included a sturdy log house that had been built by a family that had subsequently moved further west, along with a barn and outbuildings, and several cleared acres. The Cunningham sisters set about converting the house into an inn with remarkable efficiency and apparently substantial resources. They hired local men to make improvements and additions to the building. They purchased furniture and supplies from merchants in larger towns, and within 3 months they had transformed the property into what appeared to be a well-appointed, welcoming inn suitable for travelers of respectable means. Millbrook Inn opened for business in September of 1846, advertised through notices in newspapers in larger towns and by word of mouth along the road. The Cunningham sisters positioned their establishment as a respectable, even refined, alternative to the rougher accommodations typically available on frontier roads. They promised clean beds, good food, and civilized company, and they set their prices at a level that suggested quality while remaining accessible to middle-class travelers. From the beginning, there was something unusual about how the Cunningham sisters ran their inn, though the peculiarities were subtle enough that they didn't immediately raise suspicions. The sisters were selective about which travelers they accepted as guests. They would turn away rough-looking men, large groups, or anyone who seemed potentially troublesome, claiming their establishment was small and they wanted to maintain a certain standard. This selectivity, while unusual, was attributed to the sisters' desire to run a respectable house and to their natural caution as women operating without male protection. The sisters also had a practice of offering their guests a particular drink upon arrival, a special recipe, they said, that helped travelers relax after long days on the road. This drink, served in the parlor before dinner, was presented as a gesture of hospitality and refinement, part of what made Millbrook Inn special. Guests who mentioned the drink in letters home or in conversations at subsequent stops on their journeys described it as having an unusual but not unpleasant taste, and as being quite effective at producing relaxation and drowsiness. What neither the Cunningham sisters' guests nor the Millbrook community knew was that this special drink was laced with laudanum, a tincture of opium that was legal and widely available in the 1840s for medicinal purposes. In small doses, laudanum produced a pleasant sense of relaxation and well-being. In larger doses, it caused deep sleep from which it was difficult to wake. And in very large doses, particularly when combined with alcohol or administered to someone who was already exhausted from travel, laudanum could slow breathing and heart rate to the point of death. The Cunningham sisters' method, as would later be reconstructed from evidence found at the inn and from analysis of their victims, was brutally simple and effective. They targeted travelers who met certain criteria, traveling alone or in very small groups, preferably with visible wealth in the form of good horses, quality clothing, or other indicators of money, and importantly, travelers who were passing through the area rather than going to a specific destination where they would be expected, and their absence quickly noted. These carefully selected victims would be invited to stay at the inn, where they would be treated with warmth and hospitality. The Cunningham sisters were reportedly charming hosts, engaging their guests in conversation, showing interest in their lives and travels, and creating an atmosphere of comfort and safety. Before dinner, guests would be offered the special drink. After consuming this laudanum-laced beverage, guests would become drowsy and disoriented. The sisters would help them to their rooms, ostensibly so they could rest before dinner. Once the victims were unconscious in their rooms, the Cunningham sisters would rob them of all valuables: money, jewelry, quality clothing, anything that could be sold or used. But the sisters didn't stop at robbery. They were also killers, and their method of murder was as cold and calculated as their robberies. While their victims slept, drugged and helpless, the sisters would administer additional doses of laudanum, often mixed with other substances, ensuring that the victims would never wake. The bodies would be wrapped in blankets and stored temporarily in the cellar of the inn. Then, under cover of darkness, the sisters would bury them in the hillside grave site that they had apparently prepared before even opening the inn. The graves were dug efficiently and deep enough to prevent animals from disturbing them. The sisters would fill in each grave, replace the topsoil and vegetation, and return to their inn as if nothing had happened. The victims' belongings posed a different problem. Items that were too distinctive or too valuable to sell locally had to be disposed of carefully. The sisters appeared to have a system for this as well, traveling periodically to larger towns where they could sell items without attracting attention, probably claiming the goods had belonged to deceased relatives or had been acquired through estate sales. Money and jewelry could be kept or used discreetly. Horses and wagons were more problematic. These were sold or traded in distant locations, with bills of sale that would be difficult to trace back to the Cunningham sisters. Over the course of approximately 18 months, from September 1846 through early 1848, the Cunningham sisters murdered at least 43 people at Millbrook Inn. The victims ranged from young men traveling alone to older couples, from merchants to farmers, from people of modest means to those who were relatively wealthy. What they had in common was that they had made the fatal mistake of accepting the Cunningham sisters' hospitality. How did the sisters avoid suspicion for so long? Several factors worked in their favor. First, the transient nature of frontier travel meant that people regularly passed through areas without anyone knowing their exact routes or schedules. A traveler who disappeared between one town and another might have gotten lost, had an accident, been the victim of natural disaster or animal attack, or simply changed their route. Families waiting for travelers who never arrived often assumed some such explanation, and unless there were multiple disappearances that could be definitively linked, there was no obvious pattern to raise alarm. Second, the Cunningham sisters' selectivity about their victims meant they were targeting people whose absence would not be immediately noticed or connected to their inn. They avoided taking guests who were expected at specific destinations on specific dates, or who were traveling with companions who might survive and tell tales. They were patient, sometimes turning away potential victims if the risk seemed too high, waiting for ideal targets. Third, the sisters had established themselves as respectable members of the community. They attended church regularly. They were polite and proper in all their interactions. They paid their bills promptly, and they maintained the appearance of propriety that Victorian society demanded of middle-class women. The very idea that two women running a respectable inn might be cold-blooded killers was almost unthinkable in the social context of the 1840s. Women were assumed to be naturally gentle and moral, incapable of the kind of violence the sisters were actually committing. Fourth, and perhaps most cunningly, the sisters occasionally had guests who stayed at the inn and left safely, providing testimonials about the quality of the establishment. These survivors served as unwitting character references, making it even less likely that anyone would suspect foul play. The sisters carefully managed the balance between killing frequently enough to generate substantial profit, but not so frequently that the pattern would be noticed. But even the most careful criminals eventually make mistakes or encounter circumstances beyond their control. For the Cunningham sisters, their downfall came not through any major error on their part, but through a combination of chance events and the eventual weight of accumulating small inconsistencies that began to raise questions. The first crack in the sisters' facade came in the winter of 1847-48, when a traveling merchant named William Thatcher arrived at the inn on a cold December evening. Thatcher was tired, hungry, and grateful for the warm welcome the Cunningham sisters provided. He accepted their offer of the special relaxing drink, and he felt the familiar drowsiness that the laudanum produced. But Thatcher, unlike many previous victims, had a relatively high tolerance for opiates. He had been prescribed laudanum for pain after an injury years earlier and had used it regularly for some time. The dose that would have rendered most people unconscious merely made Thatcher extremely drowsy. When Abigail Cunningham entered Thatcher's room expecting to find him deeply unconscious, she instead found him groggily semi-conscious, aware enough to be confused about why this woman was going through his belongings. Thinking quickly, Abigail claimed she had come to collect his clothing for cleaning, a service the inn provided. Thatcher, too foggy to think clearly but also too alert to simply pass out, accepted this explanation but also felt a vague sense that something was wrong. The sisters, recognizing that Thatcher had not been adequately drugged and that attempting to kill him now would be too risky, made a quick decision to let him live. They treated him normally for the rest of his stay, and he left the next morning with only a strange story about feeling unusually drowsy after drinking something at the inn, and having a confused memory of the proprietress in his room at night. Thatcher didn't report this to authorities. He had no clear evidence of wrongdoing, and his memory of the events was fuzzy. But he did mention the incident to others during his travels, including a conversation he had several weeks later with a town sheriff in a community about 50 miles from Millbrook. This sheriff, a man named Josiah Fletcher who was more perceptive than many of his contemporaries, found Thatcher's story interesting. Fletcher had heard occasional rumors and reports over the past year about travelers who had apparently disappeared along the roads in his region. None of these disappearances had seemed connected or particularly suspicious individually, but Fletcher had been keeping track, and he was troubled by the pattern. Thatcher's story about being drugged at an inn gave Fletcher a possible explanation for at least some of these disappearances. Fletcher began making inquiries, writing letters to colleagues in other towns, asking about missing travelers and about any inns or establishments along the routes where travelers might have encountered problems. Through this process, Fletcher learned about Millbrook Inn and the Cunningham Sisters, and he also learned that several families in different towns had reported relatives who had gone missing while traveling along roads that would have taken them past Millbrook. This alone wasn't enough for legal action. The evidence was circumstantial and spread across multiple jurisdictions. But Fletcher decided to pay a visit to Millbrook to ask some questions and perhaps have a look at this inn that had been mentioned in connection with a traveler's strange experience. In February of 1848, Fletcher made the journey to Millbrook, announced himself to the local constable, and explained his concerns. The Millbrook constable, a part-time official who also ran the general store, was initially skeptical and defensive of the Cunningham sisters, whom he considered valued members of the community. But Fletcher's status as a more experienced lawman from a larger town and his presentation of the pattern of disappearances was persuasive enough that the constable agreed to accompany Fletcher to the inn to ask some questions. When Fletcher and the constable arrived at Millbrook Inn on a cold February afternoon in 1848, they found the establishment apparently closed. The building was locked, there was no smoke from the chimneys, and no one answered their knocks. Neighbors told them that the Cunningham sisters had departed about 3 weeks earlier, saying they needed to travel to visit a sick relative and weren't sure when they would return. They had left the inn locked up and had taken a substantial amount of luggage with them when they left. This sudden departure by itself wasn't necessarily suspicious. People did have family emergencies and did travel. But combined with Fletcher's concerns about disappearances and Thatcher's strange experience, it was enough to justify a more thorough investigation. Fletcher obtained permission to enter the inn and conduct a search of the premises. What Fletcher and his companions found when they entered the inn was at first unremarkable. The building was clean and well-maintained, furnished respectably, showing no obvious signs of criminal activity. But as they searched more thoroughly, they began to find items that raised questions. In a locked trunk in one of the bedrooms, they found jewelry, watches, and other personal items that seemed to be from multiple different people. The quantity and variety suggested this was not simply the Cunningham sisters' personal possessions. In the cellar, they found a disturbing collection of items hidden beneath loose floorboards. More jewelry, several wallets and purses, documents including personal letters and identification papers belonging to different individuals, and most damningly, a detailed ledger in handwriting that appeared to be Abigail Cunningham's. This ledger, kept with meticulous care, recorded dates, brief descriptions of individuals, amounts of money and lists of valuable items, and cryptic notes that seemed to correspond to murders and robberies. Fletcher realized he was looking at evidence of multiple crimes, though the exact nature and extent wasn't yet clear. He organized a more extensive search of the property and surrounding grounds. It was during this search, on the third day of the investigation, that one of the searchers discovered a depression in the ground on a hillside about 200 yards behind the inn. When they began to dig, they found a body, and then another, and then another. Over the next week, investigators unearthed 43 graves from the hillside. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, but many retained enough of their clothing and belongings that they could be identified. As Fletcher sent inquiries to other towns with descriptions of these victims and the items found with them, families began to confirm that their missing relatives had been found. The scale of the horror became clear. The Cunningham sisters had murdered at least 43 people over the course of less than 2 years. A massive manhunt was launched for the Cunningham sisters, now identified as the most wanted criminals in several states. Descriptions were circulated, rewards were offered, and law enforcement across the region was on alert. But the sisters seemed to have vanished as completely as their victims had. Months passed with no confirmed sightings, and it began to seem as though they might have escaped justice entirely. Then, in July of 1848, 2 women matching the Cunningham sisters' descriptions were arrested in St. Louis, Missouri, trying to board a steamboat that would take them down the Mississippi to New Orleans. They were carrying forged identity papers under different names, but their physical descriptions matched, and they were in possession of items that were identified as having belonged to some of the Millbrook Inn victims. The women were returned to Kentucky to face trial for the murders. During the investigation and trial, their true identities and backgrounds slowly emerged, though even today, some aspects remain murky and disputed. The woman who had called herself Abigail Cunningham was actually named Sarah Haddock, born in Pennsylvania around 1810, from a respectable family that had disowned her after she had been involved in various scandals and crimes in her youth. The woman who had called herself Constance Cunningham was Mary Wade, born in New York around 1812, who had a criminal record including theft and fraud. The 2 women had met in Cincinnati in the early 1840s, and had apparently formed a criminal partnership, operating various scams and cons before hitting upon the idea of the murder in scheme. They had saved money from their previous criminal activities, which they used to establish Millbrook Inn, and they had planned the operation carefully, selecting the location specifically for its isolation and the transient nature of the traffic along the road. The trial of Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade, the names under which they were prosecuted, though newspapers continued to refer to them as the Cunningham Sisters, was one of the most sensational in American legal history to that point. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Journalists came from across the country to cover the proceedings, and the lurid details of the murders and the number of victims captured public imagination and horror. The evidence against the women was overwhelming. The ledger that had been found at the inn was presented as evidence, with prosecutors walking the jury through entry after entry that corresponded to identified victims and their belongings. Survivors of the inn, including William Thatcher, testified about being drugged. Families of victims provided heartbreaking testimony about their lost loved ones. Physical evidence from the graves and from items found at the inn tied the women to specific victims. The defense attempted to argue that the women had been forced into the crimes by a male accomplice who had since fled, that they were victims themselves of circumstances and coercion. This argument might have had some traction in an era when women were assumed to be passive and easily influenced by men, but the meticulous record-keeping in the ledger, the careful planning evident in how the inn had been established and operated, and the sheer duration and scale of the crimes made this defense unconvincing. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade were sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was carried out in September of 1848, with both women hanged together before a crowd of thousands who had traveled to witness the event. Contemporary accounts describe the women as composed and unrepentant to the end, with Haddock reportedly saying only, "I regret we were caught," as her final words. The aftermath of the Millbrook Inn murders was far-reaching and long-lasting. The families of the 43 identified victims mourned their dead and struggled with the horror of how they had died. The community of Millbrook was traumatized and shamed by having hosted such evil in their midst. The inn itself was burned to the ground shortly after the trial, with local residents wanting to erase the physical reminder of the crimes. The graves on the hillside became a site of pilgrimage and morbid curiosity. For years, people would visit to see where the victims had been buried. Eventually, most of the identified victims were exhumed and returned to their families for proper burial. The unidentified victims, of whom there were several, were reinterred in the local cemetery with a memorial stone that acknowledged them as victims of the Millbrook Inn murders. The case sparked conversations about the vulnerability of travelers, the need for better law enforcement, and the nature of evil. The idea that two women could commit such crimes challenged Victorian assumptions about female nature and morality. The case was written about extensively in newspapers and books, with various theories proposed about what had made the Cunningham sisters capable of such systematic murder. Some writers emphasized their greed and lack of moral feeling. Others suggested that they had been corrupted by their early experiences and had descended into ever worse criminality. Still others took a more sensational approach, painting them as monsters who had always been evil, born without conscience or humanity. Modern psychologists who have studied the case have suggested that both women likely had antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, combined with intelligence and planning ability that made them exceptionally dangerous. The Millbrook Inn case also became part of American folklore and legend, with the Cunningham sisters becoming bogeywoman figures in cautionary tales told to warn travelers about the dangers of trusting strangers too easily. The case has been referenced in literature, has been the subject of multiple books and articles, and has been studied by criminologists interested in serial killers and in female criminals. Over the years since the murders, additional questions and theories have emerged about aspects of the case that were never fully resolved. How many victims were there really? The 43 graves that were found represented confirmed victims, but the Cunningham sisters had operated for 18 months, and there were gaps in the ledger and periods when no graves were found that corresponded to the dates. Did the sisters have a different burial site that was never discovered? Were there victims who were disposed of in other ways? Another persistent question has been whether the sisters had accomplices. The logistics of running an inn, murdering dozens of people, disposing of bodies, and managing the stolen goods would have been challenging for two women working alone. Some researchers have suggested there must have been at least one male accomplice, perhaps a hired hand or associate who helped with the heavy work of burial and who fled before the crimes were discovered. No such accomplice was ever identified or caught, and the sisters never implicated anyone else in their crimes, but the theory persists. There are also questions about what happened to all the money and valuables the sisters stole. The ledger suggested they had accumulated substantial wealth from their crimes, thousands of dollars in cash, plus jewelry and other valuables. Yet when they were arrested in St. Louis, they had relatively little money on them, and no hidden cache of wealth was ever found at the inn or in any properties or accounts that could be traced to them. Did they spend it all? Did they send it somewhere or hide it where it has never been found? This mystery has led to occasional treasure hunting efforts around the former inn site, though nothing has ever been discovered. The site of Millbrook Inn itself has an interesting history. After the inn was burned in 1848, the land lay abandoned for many years. No one wanted to build on or farm land associated with such horror. Eventually, the property was purchased by the county, and the area where the inn had stood was incorporated into the road that had initially been under construction when the graves were discovered. The hillside where the graves were located was left as wooded, undeveloped land, and it remains so today. In the 20th century, as interest in true crime and historical mysteries grew, the Millbrook Inn case gained renewed attention. Researchers investigated the historical records, interviewed descendants of victims and community members, and tried to piece together a complete picture of what had happened. This research resulted in several books and articles that brought the case to new audiences. In 1996, forensic archaeologists received permission to conduct a careful excavation of the hillside grave site using modern techniques. They hoped to learn more about the victims and the sisters' methods through forensic analysis that hadn't been possible in the 1840s. The excavation confirmed that the site had contained at least 43 graves, and possibly a few more that had been too disturbed by the original excavation to count accurately. Forensic analysis of remains that were still present provided some information about causes of death. Several showed signs of opiate poisoning, and about the victims' demographics, though much had been learned from the original investigation. In 2007, a memorial was erected at the site with a plaque listing the names of the 43 confirmed victims of the Millbrook Inn murders. An annual remembrance ceremony is now held on the anniversary of the discovery of the graves, attended by descendants of victims, local historians, and members of the community who want to ensure that the victims are not forgotten, and that the lessons of the case, about the nature of evil, the importance of vigilance, and the value of human life, are passed down to new generations. The case of the Cunningham Sisters and the 43 graves of Millbrook Inn remains one of the most disturbing and fascinating crime stories in American history. Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade, operating under false identities in a remote frontier inn, killed at least 43 people over 18 months with cold calculation and systematic efficiency. Their crimes shocked the nation, challenged assumptions about female nature and capability, and left a legacy of questions and horror that persists nearly 2 centuries later. The Cunningham sisters offered what appeared to be comfort, hospitality, and even love to their visitors. A warm welcome, a comfortable bed, kind words, and attention that made weary travelers feel cared for. But this apparent love was a mask for something infinitely darker, a calculated exploitation of human trust and vulnerability, a cold decision to murder for profit, and a willingness to kill again and again without apparent remorse or hesitation. As we remember the 43 known victims and the unknown number of others who may have died at Millbrook Inn, we are reminded that evil can wear a pleasant face, that monsters are not always immediately recognizable as such, and that the veneer of respectability and civilization can hide the darkest of intentions. The Cunningham sisters have been dead for over 170 years, executed for their crimes, but the graves on that Kentucky hillside remain a testament to their victims and a reminder of the capacity for human cruelty. The investigation that followed the discovery of the 43 graves was one of the most extensive and complex criminal investigations in 1840s America, hampered by the limitations of the era, but driven forward by the shock and horror of what had been discovered. Sheriff Josiah Fletcher, who had been instrumental in uncovering the crimes, took personal charge of the investigation, working tirelessly to identify victims, trace the Cunningham sisters' movements, and build a case that would ensure justice was done. The process of identifying the victims was painstaking and heartbreaking. Each body had to be examined, any remaining clothing or personal effects cataloged, and descriptions compiled that could be circulated to communities across the region. In the 1840s, before photography was common or widespread, this meant relying on written descriptions of physical characteristics, clothing, and personal items that might help families recognize their missing loved ones. Fletcher sent letters to sheriffs and constables in towns throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Ohio, and surrounding states, describing the victims and asking if anyone had reported relatives who had gone missing while traveling through the region. The response was overwhelming and devastating. Within weeks, Fletcher had received dozens of letters from families describing missing relatives, who matched the descriptions of bodies found at Millbrook Inn. The identification process involved bringing family members to view the remains when possible, a terrible ordeal for these grieving relatives, but one that was necessary to confirm identities. Some victims could be identified through distinctive items of clothing or jewelry that families recognized. Others were identified through physical characteristics, a missing tooth, a particular scar, an unusual feature that family members could confirm. In several cases, multiple families claimed the same body based on similar descriptions, requiring careful investigation to determine which identification was correct. By the time the investigation was complete, 43 victims had been positively identified, though investigators believed there might have been additional victims whose bodies had been disposed of differently or whose families never came forward. The identified victims ranged widely in age, background, and circumstances. The youngest was a boy of 14 who had been traveling to take up an apprenticeship with a blacksmith. The oldest was a man of 62 who had been visiting relatives and returning to his home when he stopped at Millbrook Inn. Among the victims were merchants carrying goods to sell in distant markets, farmers traveling to purchase livestock or equipment, families relocating to new homes, circuit preachers spreading the gospel across the frontier, and various other travelers whose journeys had brought them to Millbrook Inn at the wrong time. What united them beyond their tragic fate was that they had been traveling with at least some money or valuables, and they had been passing through the area, rather than traveling to a specific destination where their absence would be immediately noticed. The ledger that Fletcher had discovered at the inn proved to be a devastating piece of evidence and a chilling window into how the Cunningham sisters had operated. The ledger was a standard account book of the type used by merchants and business owners to track transactions. But instead of recording ordinary business dealings, it recorded murders and thefts with the same meticulous attention to detail that a legitimate business owner might use to track inventory and sales. Each entry in the ledger included a date, a brief description of the victim, often just a physical characteristic or occupation: tall merchant, farmer with wife, young minister, a list of valuables taken, amounts of cash, descriptions of jewelry or watches, quality of clothing or other goods, and occasionally cryptic notes that seemed to record disposal of bodies or sale of stolen goods. The handwriting was neat and controlled, the entries organized chronologically, and the overall impression was one of systematic, business-like approach to murder. Reading through this ledger, Fletcher and other investigators could trace the progression of the sisters' crimes. The early entries from the fall of 1846 were relatively sparse and showed some caution. Weeks might pass between entries, suggesting the sisters were being selective and careful. But as time went on and they apparently gained confidence that they could continue without being caught, the entries became more frequent. By the summer of 1847, there were periods where multiple entries appeared within days of each other, suggesting the sisters were killing at an accelerated pace. The ledger also revealed the sisters' cold calculation in selecting victims. There were notations that suggested they had turned away potential guests who didn't meet their criteria. Notes like "too poor," "traveling in group," or "expected at destination" appeared occasionally, indicating people who the sisters had assessed as either not worth the risk or too likely to be missed. This selection process had been key to their ability to operate for so long without detection. Fletcher's investigation also focused on tracing what had happened to the money and goods the sisters had stolen. The ledger suggested they had accumulated substantial wealth, cash totals in the thousands of dollars, plus jewelry and other valuables that would have been worth considerably more. Yet when the sisters were eventually arrested in St. Louis, they had relatively modest amounts of money and only a few pieces of jewelry with them. Investigation into the sisters' financial affairs revealed that they had made several trips to larger cities during the period they operated the inn to Louisville, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. During these trips, they had apparently sold stolen goods to various merchants and pawnbrokers, though tracing these transactions was difficult because the sisters had used different names, and because the merchants had no reason to suspect the goods were stolen or to keep detailed records of purchases from random sellers. The sisters had also deposited money in banks in different cities under various names, though much of this money had been withdrawn and taken with them when they fled. Some investigators believed the sisters might have buried or hidden money somewhere, perhaps intending to return for it later, though no such cash was ever found despite extensive searching around the inn property and along routes the sisters were known to have traveled. As Fletcher built his case against the Cunningham sisters, he also worked to understand who these women really were and how they had come to commit such terrible crimes. This investigation into their backgrounds proved challenging because much of what they had told people in Millbrook had been lies, and their previous use of multiple false identities made tracking their real histories difficult. The breakthrough in understanding the sisters' true identities came when Fletcher received a letter from a police detective in Cincinnati who had seen a circular describing the wanted women. The detective recognized the descriptions as matching two women who had been involved in various frauds and confidence schemes in Cincinnati in the early 1840s. He provided their names, Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade, and described their known criminal activities. With these real names, Fletcher was able to trace the women's backgrounds more successfully. Sarah Haddock, who had called herself Abigail Cunningham, was born in western Pennsylvania in 1810 to a respectable merchant family. She had been educated and raised with all the advantages of middle-class life, but from her teenage years she had shown troubling behavior, lying, stealing from family members, manipulating people, and showing no remorse when caught. Her family had tried various interventions, including religious counseling and brief stays with strict relatives meant to reform her behavior, but nothing had worked. By her early 20s, Sarah had been involved in various scandals, including romantic relationships with married men whom she had blackmailed, theft from employers, and fraudulent schemes. Her family had eventually disowned her, and she had left Pennsylvania to make her way through a series of cities, supporting herself through various criminal activities. Mary Wade, who had called herself Constance Cunningham, had a similar background, though from a different starting point. Born in New York in 1812 to a poor family, Mary had grown up in difficult circumstances with an alcoholic father and overwhelmed mother. She had received minimal education and had been placed in domestic service as a young teenager to help support her family. Mary had shown early criminal tendencies, stealing from the families she worked for and lying with remarkable facility. By her late teens, she had graduated to more sophisticated crimes, including working with male accomplices to rob travelers and operating various confidence schemes. She had served a brief jail sentence in her early 20s for theft, and after release had continued her criminal activities with apparently increasing sophistication. Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade had met in Cincinnati around 1843 or 1844, both operating in the same criminal circles, and had apparently recognized kindred spirits in each other. They had worked together on various schemes before conceiving the idea for the murder in operation. The scheme required capital to establish the inn and patience to operate it successfully, qualities both women apparently possessed. The psychological question that fascinated many observers then, and continues to interest criminologists today, is how two women could commit such systematic, repeated murders with apparent lack of remorse. Various theories were proposed both at the time and in subsequent years. Some attributed it to moral depravity and evil nature. Others suggested the women had been corrupted by their early exposure to crime and had gradually escalated to murder. Still others proposed that one woman had been the dominant personality who had led the other into increasingly terrible acts. Modern psychological analysis suggests both women likely had antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy, a condition characterized by lack of empathy, shallow emotions, manipulativeness, and absence of genuine guilt or remorse. The combination of intelligence, planning ability, and complete lack of conscience made them exceptionally dangerous. The fact that they found each other and formed a criminal partnership allowed them to reinforce and enable each other's worst tendencies rather than having any moderating influence. The partnership between the two women also appears to have been genuinely close in its own twisted way. Letters between them that were found during the investigation, written during periods when they were apart on trips to sell stolen goods, showed a relationship that was both business partnership and something more intimate. They referred to each other with affection, shared private jokes, and appeared to have genuine trust in each other, ironic given their complete lack of trustworthiness toward anyone else. As the manhunt for the Cunningham sisters intensified in early 1848, Fletcher coordinated with law enforcement across multiple states, distributing descriptions and offering substantial rewards for information leading to the women's capture. The sisters had a several-week head start, having fled the inn in mid-January before the investigation began in early February, and they had considerable skill at using false identities and blending into new environments. For several months, There were reported sightings but no confirmed captures. The sisters were reportedly seen in various cities: Nashville, Memphis, Louisville. But each time law enforcement arrived to investigate, the women had already moved on or the sighting proved to be mistaken identity. Fletcher began to fear that the women might escape entirely, perhaps leaving the country or disappearing into some remote area where they would never be found. The sisters' eventual capture in St. Louis in July 1848 came about through a combination of good detective work and bad luck on the women's part. A pawnbroker in St. Louis had become suspicious of two women who had tried to sell him several expensive pieces of jewelry, something that was unusual for women of their apparent middle-class respectability. The pieces were distinctive enough that the pawnbroker recognized them from descriptions on a wanted circular he had received. Rather than confront the women directly, the pawnbroker told them he needed time to evaluate the jewelry and asked them to return the next day. He then immediately contacted the police, who set up surveillance. When the women returned to the pawn shop, they were arrested without incident. They initially gave false names and claimed to be respectable widows, but when their luggage was searched and items belonging to Millbrook Inn victims were found, their true identities were confirmed. The extradition process to return the women to Kentucky was complicated by legal procedures and by the women's attempts to fight extradition, but eventually they were transported back under heavy guard. The journey attracted enormous public attention, with crowds gathering at every stop to see the notorious murderesses. The women were kept in separate cells and under constant watch to prevent suicide attempts or escape. Once in Kentucky awaiting trial, both women were examined by physicians and religious counselors who tried to understand them and to obtain confessions. The physicians found them physically healthy and mentally sound by the standards of evaluation available in the 1840s. They were clearly aware of right and wrong, understood the nature of their actions, and showed no signs of the kinds of delusions or mental deterioration that might constitute insanity. The religious counselors who visited them hoping to obtain deathbed-style confessions and expressions of remorse were uniformly frustrated. Both women refused to confess to the murders in any detail, though they didn't deny being at the inn or knowing about the victims. They showed no emotional reaction to discussions of their victims, no tears or expressions of guilt, and no interest in seeking spiritual redemption. One minister who visited Sarah Haddock reported that she seemed more interested in criticizing the quality of her jail cell than in contemplating her eternal soul. The trial began in August 1848 and lasted for 3 weeks, an unusually long trial for the era. The prosecution was led by the district attorney, with assistance from special prosecutors brought in because of the case's significance and complexity. The defense was handled by court-appointed attorneys who faced the unenviable task of defending women accused of over 40 murders with overwhelming evidence against them. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the ledger and walked the jury through its entries, matching them to identified victims. They brought in family members of victims to testify about their lost loved ones and to identify items found at the inn. They presented testimony from William Thatcher about being drugged, from neighbors about suspicious activities at the inn, from merchants who had sold laudanum to the sisters, and from law enforcement about the discovery of the graves. The physical evidence was extensive: jewelry and watches identified by families, clothing with distinctive features, documents belonging to victims, and the ledger that tied everything together. Medical experts testified about the effects of laudanum poisoning and confirmed that several of the victims whose remains were examined showed signs consistent with opiate overdose. The defense strategy was limited by the strength of the evidence. They attempted to argue that the women had been coerced by a male accomplice who had actually committed the murders, while the women had merely been present and afraid to stop him or report him. This mysterious male accomplice was never identified or produced, and the defense's argument was weakened by the ledger, which was clearly in one of the women's handwriting and showed detailed knowledge of and involvement in all aspects of the crimes. The defense also tried to argue that at least some of the victims might have died of natural causes, that perhaps the laudanum had been given as legitimate medicine, and some guests had accidentally overdosed, and that the women had panicked and hidden the bodies rather than report the deaths. This argument was undermined by the systematic nature of the crimes, the hidden burial ground prepared in advance, and the extensive theft of victims' property. Throughout the trial, both Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade remained composed and largely emotionless. They showed no visible distress when victims' families testified, no reaction to graphic descriptions of the murders, and no apparent concern about their own fates. This lack of normal human emotion actually worked against them with the jury, who interpreted it as evidence of their fundamentally evil natures. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both women. The judge sentenced both to death by hanging, the standard punishment for murder in Kentucky at that time. The women showed no reaction to the sentences, maintaining the same calm demeanor they had displayed throughout the trial. In the weeks between sentencing and execution, both women were visited by numerous people hoping to understand them, obtain confessions, or satisfy morbid curiosity. They were also visited by journalists who wrote extensive accounts of their final days. These accounts described the women as maintaining their composure and showing no signs of remorse or fear of death. Sarah Haddock apparently spent her final weeks reading books and newspapers and complaining about the poor quality of prison food. She refused to discuss her crimes in any detail and showed no interest in religious consolation. When asked if she had any regrets, she reportedly said her only regret was being caught, a statement that shocked even the hardened observers who heard it. Mary Wade was slightly more communicative, giving interviews where she blamed her early poverty and difficult childhood for starting her on a criminal path, though she never explicitly admitted to the murders or showed genuine remorse. She seemed more interested in her place in history, asking whether she would be remembered and what would be written about her. The execution was scheduled for September 15, 1848, and was to be carried out publicly as was standard practice at the time. Public executions served both as punishment and as deterrent, with large crowds gathering to witness justice being done. The execution of 2 women for such horrific crimes was expected to draw an especially large crowd, and officials prepared accordingly. On the day of the execution, an estimated crowd of over 5,000 people gathered, coming from across Kentucky and surrounding states to witness the event. Vendors sold food and souvenirs, families brought picnic lunches, and the atmosphere was disturbingly festival-like, a common feature of public executions in that era that many social reformers found troubling. The women were brought from their cells in the early afternoon and taken by cart to the gallows that had been erected in a field outside town. Both were dressed in simple dark dresses and had their hands bound. They were offered the opportunity to make final statements, which was traditional for condemned prisoners. Sarah Haddock declined to speak. Mary Wade made a brief statement thanking the jailers for treating them well, and saying that she hoped her fate would serve as a warning to other young women to avoid the path of crime. The statement was notable for what it didn't include: no admission of guilt, no apology to victims' families, no expression of remorse. The execution was carried out simultaneously for both women, with 2 separate nooses and trap doors. At precisely 2:00 p.m., the traps were sprung. Both women died quickly, with apparently no struggling or prolonged suffering, which witnesses noted was more merciful than they had been to their victims. The bodies were left hanging for the customary period, then taken down and prepared for burial. Neither woman had family who claimed their bodies, so they were buried in a pauper section of the local cemetery in unmarked graves. Some people suggested the bodies should be disposed of in some less dignified way given the enormity of their crimes, but officials decided that even condemned criminals deserved basic burial dignity. The location of their graves was not recorded publicly to prevent them from becoming sites of morbid pilgrimage or vandalism. The aftermath of the Millbrook Inn murders and the trial and execution of the Cunningham Sisters had profound and lasting impacts on multiple levels: on the victims' families, on the community of Millbrook, on law enforcement practices, and on public consciousness and culture. For the families of the 43 identified victims, the discovery of what had happened to their loved ones brought terrible closure. Many families had been living with uncertainty for months or even over a year, not knowing whether their missing relatives were alive or dead, holding out hope that perhaps they were somewhere safe and would eventually return. The discovery that they had been murdered and buried in a mass grave site was devastating, shattering whatever comforting illusions families had maintained. The process of reclaiming their loved ones' remains and providing proper burial was both necessary for closure and traumatic in itself. Many families traveled long distances to Kentucky to identify remains and make arrangements for their loved ones to be returned home for burial. The condition of the remains after months or over a year in the ground meant that in many cases families could not see their loved ones' faces one final time, making the grief even more difficult to process. Families also had to live with the knowledge of how their loved ones had died: drugged, helpless, murdered for mere money, buried without dignity in a mass grave. This knowledge often haunted surviving family members for the rest of their lives. Children who had lost parents, spouses who had lost partners, parents who had lost children, all carried the burden of knowing their loved ones' final hours had been marked by betrayal and violence. Some families found some measure of peace in the fact that the killers had been caught, tried, and executed. Justice had been done, at least in legal terms. But for others, no amount of justice could balance the scales or bring back what they had lost. The execution of Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade didn't resurrect the victims or undo the trauma the families had experienced. The community of Millbrook was fundamentally changed by the discovery of the murders in their midst. The town had been small, close-knit, and characterized by the kind of trust and mutual support common in frontier communities. The revelation that two women they had welcomed, trusted, and considered respectable members of the community had been systematic murderers shattered that sense of trust and safety. People questioned how they had missed the signs, how they had been so completely deceived. The Cunningham sisters had attended church with them, had socialized with them, had been friendly and proper in all their interactions. How could such monsters have hidden in plain sight? The answer was deeply disturbing. Evil didn't always announce itself, and people who seemed respectable and normal could be capable of terrible acts. The town also struggled with shame and stigma. Millbrook became nationally known as the site of the horrific murder inn, and this notoriety brought unwanted attention and a stain on the community's reputation. For years afterward, people from Millbrook who traveled to other places would sometimes face questions or comments about the murders when they said where they were from. The town's name became associated with horror rather than with the ordinary agricultural community it actually was. The economic impact was also significant. The inn had been a source of business for local merchants and workers who had sold goods and services to the sisters and their guests. That business was suddenly gone. More broadly, the murders created fear among travelers about staying at inns in remote areas, which affected the hospitality industry throughout the region. It took years for trust to be rebuilt, and for travelers to again feel comfortable staying at rural inns. The physical reminders of the crimes were dealt with in various ways by the community. As mentioned earlier, the inn itself was burned down shortly after the trial, with local residents wanting to eliminate the physical structure where so many had died. The hillside where the graves were located became a kind of unofficial memorial site, with people visiting to pay respects to the victims. Over time, as most of the identified victims were reinterred in their hometowns, the hillside became a quieter place, though it retained its association with the tragedy. Law enforcement agencies learned important lessons from the Millbrook Inn case about the investigation of serial crimes, the importance of communication between jurisdictions, and the need to pay attention to patterns of disappearances. Sheriff Josiah Fletcher, whose persistence had been instrumental in uncovering the crimes, became something of an expert on criminal investigation and traveled to other communities to share what he had learned from the case. Fletcher emphasized several key points in his talks to other law enforcement officials. First, the importance of tracking missing persons systematically and looking for patterns that might indicate serial crime rather than individual incidents. Second, the need for regular communication between law enforcement in different jurisdictions to share information about crimes and suspects. Third, the danger of making assumptions about people based on their outward respectability or social status. Anyone could be a criminal regardless of how they appeared. These lessons contributed to gradual improvements in law enforcement practices across the country, though change was slow, and it would be many decades before professional, coordinated police forces became standard even in larger cities, let alone in rural areas. The case also had cultural impacts that extended beyond law enforcement and the directly affected communities. The Millbrook Inn murders became a sensation in newspapers across the country, with extensive coverage of the investigation, trial, and executions. The story had all the elements that captured public attention: dramatic discovery of multiple graves, female killers defying expectations about women's nature, systematic murders motivated by greed, elaborate deception, and ultimate justice through execution. Books and pamphlets about the case were published, some attempting serious analysis, others sensationalizing the crimes for profit. Ballads and poems were written about the murders and the victims. The story entered folklore and became part of cautionary tales told across the frontier about the dangers of trusting strangers and the importance of vigilance. The gendered aspect of the crimes received particular attention. In the Victorian era, women were assumed to be naturally gentle, moral, and nurturing, the fairer sex, with superior moral qualities that made them guardians of virtue and civilization. The Cunningham Sisters challenged these assumptions in the most dramatic way possible. Here were women who had not only committed murder but had done so repeatedly, systematically, without any apparent remorse, and who had used specifically feminine tools of hospitality and apparent caring to lure victims to their deaths. This created significant cognitive dissonance for Victorian society. Various explanations were offered to try to reconcile the Cunningham sisters' crimes with prevailing beliefs about female nature. Some writers argued the women were exceptional monsters, aberrations who didn't really count as women in the full sense. Others suggested they must have been under the influence of some unnamed male accomplice who was the real evil force. Still others used the case to argue that women, when they did turn to evil, were actually more dangerous than men, because their assumed moral superiority allowed them to deceive more effectively. Modern feminist scholars studying the case have noted that the intense focus on the women's gender revealed Victorian anxieties about female nature and the rigid gender roles of the era. The Cunningham sisters were frightening not just because they were serial killers, but because they violated fundamental assumptions about what women were and could be. Their crimes challenged the social order in ways that male criminals' crimes did not. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about capital punishment. For some people, the execution of Sarah Haddock and Mary Wade demonstrated that capital punishment was appropriate and necessary for the most heinous crimes. These two women had killed over 40 people without mercy, and their execution served both as justice for their victims and as a deterrent to potential future criminals. The large crowd that attended the execution showed public support for this view. However, others used the case to argue against capital punishment, particularly against public executions. The festival-like atmosphere at the execution, with vendors and picnickers treating it as entertainment, struck many observers as inappropriate and degrading. Reformers argued that public executions brutalized society by making spectacle of death, and that executions should at minimum be carried out privately if they were to be carried out at all. In the years following the executions, the Millbrook Inn case remained a reference point in true crime literature and in discussions of serial murder. When other serial killers emerged and were caught, and the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw numerous cases as industrialization and urbanization created new opportunities for serial killers. They were often compared to the Cunningham Sisters. The case was also studied by early criminologists and psychologists, trying to understand what made serial killers different from other criminals and from normal people. While the psychological frameworks available in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were crude compared to modern understanding, researchers recognized that people like the Cunningham sisters appeared to lack normal human empathy and conscience, and they tried to understand whether this was something people were born with or developed through their life experiences. As the 20th century progressed, and the actual events of the Millbrook Inn murders receded further into history, the case began to take on aspects of legend and folklore. The basic facts remained documented and verifiable, but various embellishments and additions crept into the story as it was retold. Some versions claimed the sisters had been witches who had used magic to lure victims. Others added elements of Gothic horror, describing the inn as a haunted house with secret passages and torture chambers. These fictional elaborations, while historically inaccurate, reflected the way the case had captured popular imagination and the human tendency to mythologize terrible events. The basic horror of the true story, that two women had systematically murdered over 40 people in an apparently respectable inn, was compelling enough that it didn't need embellishment, but storytellers through the generations couldn't resist adding dramatic details. The physical site of the former Millbrook Inn and the burial ground became part of local lore and legend. People claimed the area was haunted, reporting seeing ghostly figures in Victorian-era clothing wandering the hillside, hearing screams or moans at night, or experiencing feelings of dread and sorrow when near the site. These reports persisted for decades, and the site developed a reputation as one of Kentucky's most haunted locations. Whether these reports represented genuine paranormal phenomena, psychological responses to knowledge of the terrible events that had occurred there, or simply stories embellished in the telling, they kept the memory of the Millbrook Inn murders alive in local consciousness. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators visited the site regularly, and it was featured in various books and television programs about haunted locations. In 1947, on the centenary of the peak period of the murders, 1847, a historical marker was placed near the site of the former inn, describing the basic facts of the case and honoring the memory of the victims. The marker included the names of all 43 identified victims and a brief statement about how they had died. The placement of this marker sparked some controversy, with some people arguing that memorializing such a terrible event gave it undeserved prominence, while others countered that remembering the victims and the crimes was important for honoring the dead and learning from history. The centenary also prompted renewed historical research into the case, with scholars examining court records, newspaper accounts, and other primary sources to compile the most complete and accurate possible account of the events. This research corrected some errors and myths that had accumulated over the years and provided a clearer picture of who the Cunningham sisters really were, how they operated, and what happened to their victims. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the case gained new attention as interest in serial killers and true crime became a major genre in popular media. Books, television documentaries, and eventually podcasts featured the Millbrook Inn murders, introducing new generations to the story. These modern treatments often included psychological analysis, using current understanding of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, providing frameworks for understanding the sisters' behavior that weren't available to Victorian observers. The Forensic Archaeology Project in 1996 added new information to the historical record and allowed modern scientists to examine the physical evidence using techniques unavailable in 1849. The excavation confirmed the number and general demographics of the victims, provided some information about causes of death through analysis of remains, and offered insights into how the sisters had operated. One interesting finding from this research was evidence that the sisters had been very systematic and organized in how they buried victims. The graves were uniform in size and depth, arranged in neat rows, and showed evidence of care and preparation, even though the sisters were burying people they had murdered. This organization reinforced the picture of the Cunningham sisters as methodical, calculating killers who approached murder as a business and carried it out with cold efficiency. The 2007 memorial and the annual remembrance ceremony represented an effort by the local community and descendants of victims to properly honor those who had died, and to ensure their story was told with appropriate respect and solemnity. The memorial includes not just the names of the identified victims, but also an acknowledgement of any unidentified victims, and a statement about the importance of remembering this history. The remembrance ceremony each year draws varying crowds depending on factors like weather and anniversary significance, but it typically includes descendants of victims who want to honor their ancestors, local historians who study the case, and community members who feel it's important to remember. The ceremony usually includes reading the names of the victims, a period of silence, and often remarks from historians or descendants about the historical significance of the case and its ongoing relevance. In recent years, descendants of some of the victims have connected with each other through genealogy research and through the remembrance ceremonies. These connections have created a kind of community of people bound together by their ancestors' shared terrible fate. Some descendants have worked together on research projects to learn more about their ancestors' lives before they encountered the Cunningham sisters, reclaiming their stories and identities beyond their status as murder victims. The question of what happened to the money and valuables the Cunningham sisters stole has never been fully answered, and it continues to generate speculation and occasional treasure hunting efforts. The ledger suggested they accumulated thousands of dollars plus valuable jewelry and other items, yet most of this wealth was never recovered. Various theories exist about what happened to it. One theory is that the sisters spent more of the money than the ledger suggested, using it to fund their lifestyle, pay expenses, and make the inn appear prosperous. Another theory is that they hid money somewhere, perhaps intending to return for it after things cooled down, but that they were caught before they could retrieve it, or that they took the location of the hidden treasure to their graves rather than reveal it even to save themselves from execution. A third theory is that the sisters did send money somewhere for safekeeping, perhaps to an associate in another city, perhaps deposited under false names in banks that could not be traced. If this is the case, the money might still exist somewhere in ancient bank accounts, or might have been claimed by the banks long ago as abandoned property. Whatever the truth, the mystery of the missing Cunningham treasure has proven irresistible to some people, and over the years there have been various efforts to search for it around the former in sight and along routes the sisters were known to have traveled. Modern metal detector enthusiasts occasionally seek permission to search the area, though no significant discoveries have been reported. Most historians believe the treasure hunt is futile, and that whatever wealth the sisters accumulated was either spent, deposited in untraceable accounts, or lost to history. The legacy of the Millbrook Inn murders extends beyond the specific facts of the case to broader questions about human nature, the psychology of serial killers, the vulnerability of travelers, and the nature of trust and community. The case demonstrated that evil could hide behind a facade of respectability and normalcy, that systematic murder could be carried out in plain sight of an unsuspecting community, and that assumptions about people based on their gender, apparent social status, or outward demeanor could be dangerously wrong. For law enforcement and criminologists, the case provided early insights into the patterns and methods of serial killers, demonstrating the importance of recognizing and investigating clusters of disappearances or suspicious deaths, rather than treating each as an isolated incident. The case showed how serial killers could use legitimate business operations as cover for their crimes, and how they could exploit social expectations and trust to lure victims. For social historians, the case illuminated aspects of frontier life in 1840s America, the transient nature of the population, the isolation of rural communities, the rough justice system, and the social dynamics of a society in transition between frontier and settled civilization. The case also revealed Victorian attitudes about gender, crime, and punishment, showing both the rigidity of gender expectations and the severe consequences for those who violated them. The Millbrook Inn murders remain one of the most notorious and disturbing crime cases in American history, a story that continues to fascinate and horrify more than 170 years after the events. The 43 identified victims, men, women, and children who stopped at what appeared to be a respectable inn seeking rest and hospitality, instead found death at the hands of two women who saw them only as sources of profit. The Cunningham sisters offered love to their visitors, the appearance of care, comfort, and hospitality that made weary travelers let down their guard and trust in the kindness of strangers. But this offered love was the cruelest deception, a trap that led to murder and unmarked graves on a Kentucky hillside. The sisters' systematic betrayal of trust and human decency created a legacy of grief, horror, and enduring mystery that persists into the present day. As we remember the victims of Millbrook Inn and the terrible events of 1846-1848, we honor their memory, acknowledge the suffering of their families, and remind ourselves that vigilance, skepticism of appearances, and awareness of human capacity for evil remain necessary in every era. The 43 graves of Millbrook Inn stand as silent testimony to what happened, ensuring that these victims and the terrible crime committed against them will not be forgotten.